Welcome to Fully Exposed, a podcast that explores the taboo and unconventional in an attempt to educate your ass. I'm your host, Jessica Beuker. Let's get started. I'm here with our guest, Jamie-Lyn Minaker. Welcome, Jamie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to start with a really easy question, which is just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I studied at Ryerson University and I majored in global studies and minored in nonprofit sector management. But it was actually in my philosophy of life, death, and poverty class where I had the opportunity to take an experiential learning at a nursing home, and then I realized I'm in the wrong thing. So right from there, I went into the 2-year diploma RPN program, and now I'm doing the RPN to BSCN and working 3 jobs. So I work as a health educator as well as at 2 different hospices.
Just to clarify for our listeners, when you're not in school studying your ass off or working to make the world a healthier place as a health educator, you are a palliative care nurse working at 2 different hospices. I thought you would be the perfect guest for our topic today, as our topic is death. And that's something that you've obviously surrounded yourself with and deal with quite often. So I'm going to get into exactly what it is that you do while working at the hospice in a little bit. But first, I'd just like to know your thoughts on some things. So death is essentially the only thing in life that it's guaranteed. Everyone's going to die. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Yet even though we all know this, death remains sort of in this, like, let's not talk about it club. So there's probably not just one single definite answer to this question, but in your opinion, why do you think this is?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are very fearful of death because there's such an unknown factor to it, and it's a very unfamiliar thing. So even though we all know it's going to happen eventually, we just don't see it enough. As a society, we don't talk about it enough. We have a lot of preparation on birth and what to do when someone's coming into the world, but not enough on what to do when someone's going out of the world.
It seems that, like, after losing someone that is close to you, a lot of people go into this state of denial where they can't accept what's happening or they don't know how to properly grieve. A lot of people just bottle up all of their feelings and never really talk about it or deal with it or cry or in whatever form it is that they need to grieve. Working where you are, I'm sure you see, I mean, you're not just dealing with patients, you're obviously having interactions with their families. So you probably see firsthand the impacts of this and what it has on a person's mental health. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, so there's no right way to grieve. It looks different for everyone. Everyone feels things differently, individually. And I think if there were more supports in place, we'd be able to cope with it a lot better. But right now, there's no one right way to deal with living after someone that you loved has lost.
It's really hard to talk and to grieve about death after it's happened. But I think one of the bigger issues is possibly that we're not talking about it enough beforehand. I know personally I get totally weirded out when I go to my grandparents' house and they start asking me to tag stuff to take after they're gone. Also, my mom already has like a block at the cemetery reserved for her when she's cremated. And I remember when I found that out, I got like really teary and really uncomfortable about it. So it's a very strange thing, but talking about death before it occurs is even more taboo than talking about it after it's happened. Yet, I personally believe that if we were to talk about it beforehand, then it would maybe make death and the aftermath of death that much easier. What are your thoughts on this?
I completely agree with you, Jess. I personally feel as though we need to talk about it more as a society because the more we talk about it, the more we have plans in place, the more prepared we'll be when that time comes for ourselves or the people that we love. Not saying that it would make it any less hard, but at least you would know what to expect and what to look for.
So what then do you think are some ways that we can change this and foster more dialogues about death before it happens?
So it can start in as small a place as your dining room table, sitting with your loved ones and talking about it, asking, have you thought about what's going to happen when you die? Have you even thought about your death? It's really important to meditate on your own mortality, because if you don't, you're only sort of denying the fact that you're going to eventually die. So the more you talk about it in smaller, more intimate places, the more comfortable you'll feel about talking about it in a social setting, such as like a death cafe.
I'm actually really glad that you brought up death cafes. That's probably a word that a lot of people aren't familiar with. I myself attended a death cafe before I had heard about what they are. I thought the word itself seemed kind of like an oxymoron, very strange, and I didn't really know what I was getting into. I wasn't sure if it was going to be like a bunch of people just like sitting around cloaked in black talking about like death and Halloween, or if it was like a support group for people that were actively dying. Anyways, I went and I was pleasantly surprised. It was a group of people from all different age groups, although I found that I was quite a bit on the younger side in the group that I attended with. But it was a mixture of people who had either had people close to them die, were getting older and maybe approaching death and had questions about that, or were just very, as you mentioned in the beginning, like very just afraid of death and that unknown. And so what it was is it was essentially we were broken up into groups and we were just asked to talk about all of these different questions. And everybody who attended was just so lively and so not so much focused on death as like this ending, but as a part of life. And I really loved that. And I kind of just wanted to know, I guess, your thoughts on a death cafe and like where you think that holds a place in society and the importance of that.
I would love to see more of them. Honestly, I think it's so important to have dialogues, as in DIE-alogues, because it doesn't have to be this dark and dismal space when you think about death. It's not just this black space. It's supposed to be when you find out that you're dying. A lot of times they say that's when you relearn how to live. So by talking about it earlier, I feel like everyone would get more comfortable with the idea that we're going to die and know how to support others that are going to die as well.
Awesome. I love that. I love the finding out how to live when you experience that. It seems that if people actually, accepted and faced that they were going to die, that they would pay more attention, I guess, to their life and realize that they don't have, an infinite amount of time to just waste. So getting back to your role at hospice, can you start by explaining to our listeners what exactly a hospice is in your own words? I know it's a term we hear a lot, but I'm sure that a lot of people don't exactly know what it is. I know even myself, when I first heard of them, was kind of unclear and a little bit ignorant on the subject. So like in your own words, how would you describe what hospice is?
So hospice is more of a residential space for those who are living with a life-limiting illness to sort of have that pain control and comfort care in a very comfortable setting. So it's more of like a house with rooms and a tub and no set wake-up times, no set visiting hours. It's run by volunteers. There's baking all day long. It's a very positive, happy space where families can take more of that family role again and less of feeling as though they need to be the caregiver.
Very true, which I'm sure a lot of families kind of feel like they need to do. Definitely, I know that death is not, just scary for the people who are dying, but for all of the people that surround them, maybe even more so. Now that we know what exactly a hospice is, I want to know what exactly your job entails, all the nitty-gritty details. So can you just take me through a day in the life of a hospice nurse, beginning to end, what it is exactly that you do?
Sure. So I should mention also that no one hospice is the same as another hospice. Hospice doesn't necessarily mean it's a residential area. It could be a visiting nurse in a hospice approach. So there's a palliative approach to care. So we shouldn't say a person is palliative. You should say their approach to care is palliative. So a hospice, in my personal, the two ones that I work at, they are standalone residences. So there's 10 beds in each. There's a living room, a kitchen, where the food is free and can be prepared at any time. So I work 12-hour shifts as a nurse. So I arrive, we do something called a transfer of accountability. We talk about the residents that are currently there, which family members are there as well, if they're eating, if they're not eating, how long they've been there, and what their primary diagnosis is. And then we go around, we say hi to everyone, we see if they're having any pain, we make sure they're comfortable. Then we go back, we get our meds ready, we get breakfast ready. If people want a tub, they can have a tub. That's one of the great things about not being in a hospital sterile setting, is that if they wake up and want a tub bath, they can have a tub bath twice in a day if they want. So there's no set schedule on that. So if they want that, we do that. As nurses and PSWs, we work together, so there's no hierarchy. So we very much are a team and we share in the work. If someone is on palliative sedation, we're making sure to monitor that. A lot of the times our pain medication is done via injection. So there's these things called butterflies that stay in the skin, so we don't have to continually poke the residents, which is kind of nice. So whenever their medications are due, I go ahead and give those. But also outside of that time, their families are there a lot of the time. So I sit with their families, I get to know their families, and that is a very special aspect of hospice as well, is that you get to know the person and their families beyond their diagnosis, which is really special. And the 12 hours flies. You're definitely on your feet a lot of the time, but it's nice because it's mixed in with getting to know who that person is.
Wow, that definitely sounds like a very busy and interesting job. You mentioned that there's a lot of patient interaction, but you also mentioned that there's a lot of interaction with the families who come and visit these patients. I'm just curious to know a little bit more about that interaction. Like how does it differ, your interactions differ with those of the family members and like those of the patient?
Mm-hmm. So we call them residents because we don't want them to feel as though they're patients. But in terms of the residents' families, if we see a change happening in the resident and we want the family to know about it, we'll pull them aside, grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and maybe one of the freshly baked goods that the volunteers have made that day, and we'll go sit in a quiet room and we'll have a chat. And that'll just open up the conversation to see if they want to ask any questions, because a lot of times there's a lot of information thrown at you right away when you're with that resident, and you don't get the opportunity to ask the questions you want outside of the resident's room. So this is just that opportunity for them to address whatever they wanted to address. But it's not always business all the time. Sometimes we genuinely get to know through the residents' families their best stories of their lives. So they go through sort of a credit reel of all the greatest things that the resident has done.
That's amazing. I bet you'd have some really good stories about that. And I definitely want to circle back to that and kind of talk about some of these stories and your interactions with the patients. But again, just to focus a little on the difference between your interactions with the patients and their families, circling back to that fear that we've talked about, this fear of the unknown. I don't know, because I've obviously never been, in active dying or dealt with having a terminating illness. But from what I've heard or seen in people that I have known who have died, it kind of seems like they reach a point where they almost they've accepted that it's happening, yet you don't see that same acceptance, from my standpoint anyway, ever from the side of the friends or the family. So is that how it seems in hospice too? Like, does the sadness or the fear or the anxiety surrounding death, do you see that more from the families than you do from the residents?
It definitely varies. I think depending on when that person was brought into hospice or diagnosed initially. If they've been with the resident for a long period of time and sort of have been preparing and having those conversations, by the time they get to us, they're pretty laid back. They're very easygoing. They're just excited to have their loved one be their loved one again and not be the caregiver for that person. But definitely for those who don't have that opportunity, you see a lot of unanswered question, a lot of uneasy feelings about death and the process of death. A lot of times the residents' bodies do shut down, and you'll still walk by a family's room and see the family member feeding that person, but their body doesn't need that energy. They're not using it towards anything. So if anything, they're just going to aspirate on it. So you have to have those conversations with the families, and it's really hard sometimes because food is supposed to be something that brings people comfort. So they're just trying to do their best for their loved one. And you just sort of have to remind them that the body is shutting down and it doesn't need that anymore.
Definitely feel like those conversations would be hard. I commend you for what you do, for sure. I mean, we need more people that can do that. I'm definitely not one of those people. So that kind of leads me into my next question, which is to focus on you a little bit more and your feelings and kind of role as a hospice nurse. There kind of has been this like universal assumption that if you're going to be a doctor or a nurse or work in the medical community at all, that you need to be like a stone cold robot and not be vulnerable. You know, they always say you need people that are strong that can deal with that kind of stuff. And it brings me to this image that is very vividly in my head from, I think it was a couple years ago. There was a viral image that was circulating of this doctor who had lost a patient on the operating table. So he was a surgeon, and he was hunched outside crying. And that image went viral, and people seemed to, it kind of stirred up a very weird debate because people were very on either sides of it. You had people that were commending him for showing his vulnerability, and then you had people who were stating, well, you know, he shouldn't be doing that on the clock, like he needs to keep it together kind of thing. I just thought it was strange that we were talking about something that's so human at all, and that of all things was this big viral sensation. But I'm wondering, do you let yourself get emotional and vulnerable at work? Because you're obviously in a place where you're dealing with death much more often than like a regular doctor would be. So like, where do you have to draw yourself a line somewhere? Do you try to kind of keep it in, or do you allow yourself to feel your feelings? And like, how often does that happen?
So I see death almost every shift, and the dying every shift. I cry. I cry a lot. I'm a big crier, but it doesn't mean I'm any less strong. You don't have to be this stoic person just because you're a nurse or you're a doctor. At the end of the day, you're human. And really, society shouldn't be clouded by the fact that you have this professional title, because at the end of the day, you are human. And it shouldn't be looked at as a flaw. It's good to be vulnerable. If anything, it shows the family that you did create a connection with that resident. And it sucks to have someone be taken away after you've created a bond. It really does. But where the line would be drawn for me is of course I've cried with the family, but I'd never cry to the point where the family has to then console me, because that is crossing the line. If you find as though you're getting too emotional, then you can excuse yourself from the room and have a cry in the nurse's station. I find I am emotional. I'll give the family hugs, and then I'll leave and give them some time with their loved one. And then I'll go home and I'll write about it, or I'll do a reflection, and that's my own sort of closure on the matter.
Fair enough. Another reminder of why I don't do your job, because I think the family would have to console me, and that would just be bad news bears. I think I like what you said about that is kind of drawing, I guess, your own line. I'm sure everybody is very different in their roles. Again, it's not like a one size fits all glove with this type of thing. It's for sure very different. But again, I do think that we need more nurses and doctors that kind of, I guess, do show that vulnerability. I know whenever I've, dealt with doctors or nurses in my lifetime, that's kind of one thing that I wish that I could see a little more is sometimes you do just want to feel that comfort level and know that there's a human in there underneath that white coat. So definitely, I think that makes a lot of sense. Circling back to kind of the conversations and the bonds and the relationships that you've created with your patients and their families, I'm sure you've had a lot of interesting conversations and shared a lot of really amazing moments with the with the residents. It's going to take a while, who you work with. What have you taken away from that? Like, can you share some special stories of or moments or bonds that you've had with these residents that you've worked with?
A lot of the times, by the time someone comes to hospice, the residents sometimes can no longer speak. So the families sort of speak on their behalf, and a lot of the times they love sharing. Sometimes it's as simple as, oh, my mother used to throw the best April Fool's Day pranks on us, and they'd go on and on about what they did, and we'd have a good laugh about it around the resident, so that she knew that we were there and talking about positive and happy things, not talking above her, around her, but to her and with her, because she can still hear us, because that's one of the last senses to go. And yeah, some of them have led some really interesting, fantastic lives. And it's just, I don't know, every single person I meet, I just wish that I could have been there to see all of the amazing things that they've done, or that they've been through. It's actually really, really great to get to know those people, because you don't get that opportunity in the hospital. They're a number, they're an ID, and you bring them their meds and then you leave because it's so busy. But it's been great getting to know the people for being the people that they are.
I love that. I think what I've taken away from what you've been saying is the biggest difference between hospital care and a hospice or palliative care is really this emphasis on normalizing their environment, on comfort, on developing a relationship. I love that. I love that you get to have a relationship with your patients, and they're not just a name or a number on a clipboard. Obviously, I think there should be more of this, and it still kind of seems like a very rare thing, I guess, in some ways. I definitely know, when my grandpa passed away, they didn't have, he's from a small town, and they don't have a hospice. There is no hospice. So the best they can do is they can offer very, very, very minimal palliative care, in the sense of somebody can come to your house once in a while to check in on you. But once you actually get to the point where you need to be in a healthcare facility, it's just a room in a larger hospital, which still very much works and feels and operates like a hospital. Taking a hospital room and sticking an extra couch there and a plant in the corner and a microwave doesn't make a warm and inviting room. So I'm just wondering how you think, or if you think we're ever going to get to a point where hospices become more commonplace, and can you, I guess, what do you think really is the absolute and utmost importance of that? How important is that essentially?
I would love to see more hospices. I just don't know resource-wise if it's feasible, or if they need to move to a model where it is run outside of their homes, but the care and the quality of care is better and more frequent. It really comes down to funding, because hospices are nonprofit organizations, and a large majority of the reason that they're standing there is because they've been funded and they fundraise, and they run off of volunteers who run the phones and the front door and the kitchen. So it really, although I would love to see more in every area, I just don't know. It might take a while.
That's essentially then how hospices, you're saying, are created, is they're kind of built from the ground up from these volunteers, from these individuals. How, for like a regular like person like me who doesn't necessarily want to work at a hospice, but would love to see more of them and absolutely 100% thinks that they are crucial to our health community, how would someone like me go about getting involved or being able to contribute to helping more hospices grow and pop up in smaller cities?
So we have these things called the LINs, formerly the CCAC, but they're the local health integration networks, and they decide where the funding goes from each region. And that it comes from the Ministry of Long-Term Health, I believe. So if you wanted to get a hospice built in a specific area, I believe you could probably start a petition and they could see the need for it. I mean, I'm not an expert on the matter, but the two that I currently work at, one of them was one of the first in Ontario. Yeah, so it definitely is a lot of work. It takes a lot of money and a lot of donors, or something like a Rotary Club, something where they already are taking in large amounts of charitable donations.
Amazing. Well, definitely something for me to look into, I guess. I didn't know that those resources existed, so that's for sure good to know. For a person who has that fear of death, of that unknown, the reality is that at some point in your life, before you yourself has reached death, you're likely going to be dealing with it on more than one occasion. It's probably easier for some people than it is for others, but what advice or how would you, I guess, working in the healthcare realm, help or approach a person who just has like this crippling fear of death and doesn't really know what to do for their loved one or how to act or how to cope?
So firstly, I would let them know that that's a completely natural feeling. Of course, it's a scary thought, especially when you haven't had those conversations prior to. And I think it could be as simple as, I don't know if you've seen the movie Wit with Emma Thompson, but the nurse is having a conversation with Emma Thompson, who is dying. And she just brings out a popsicle, and she has that very hard conversation over a popsicle. And it's just one of those, you're using simple language, you're just talking about it as open and honestly as you can, and you can just see, even though it's acting, you can see the anxiety in her eyes sort of start to calm down a little bit, just something as simple as sharing a snack while talking about it, and letting people ask the questions that they need to ask, and letting them know that they're not alone. That they're never going to be alone during this process with their loved one, that there's always going to be supports. And if they want support outside of that, we also have psychosocial counselors there at the hospice, as well as music therapy and Reiki. So if they feel like they need something outside of conversation to sort of get them on board, then we offer those services as well.
So you talk a lot about being with the patients and being with their families during this time of dying. I'm imagining especially maybe for older people who maybe, didn't have children or don't have those family supports, you're maybe the only person that is there or that is interacting with them. Has that happened? And what has that been like to kind of be their main source of support during this time?
It absolutely has happened, and it is a very special, intimate moment in someone's life, and it's an absolute honor to be a part of someone's last moments. A lot of the times, because hearing is the last sense to go when someone is dying, you know that they can hear you. So a lot of the times we sit with the lights off, I hold their hand, sometimes we sing a song, and by we I mean I might be in the room with a PSW at the time, or I'll read a book out loud, or I'll just have a conversation about the weather that day, and then you'll look over and they've stopped breathing. During that time, I never stopped talking to the person, even though they stopped breathing while doing their care after death. I'm still talking to them because I feel as though their dignity is still there even in the moments when they're gone. But it's definitely a very special moment to be a part of.
Now, you've mentioned that hearing is the last thing to go of your senses, which I think is really interesting. As a nurse, I'm sure that you're equipped with the knowledge to kind of recognize the signs of death and when it's happening. Can you just maybe like share some of those with us? I mean, as I feel like the image that is portrayed in like movies and television of death and of dead people is like extremely inaccurate. But essentially my like version of it is like you turn blue right away and like you poop your pants. That's like what I've gleaned from watching movies. So I feel like I've been led astray. What are like, I guess, some of the signs and things that you look for when you know that somebody's like very close to death?
Yeah, so when death is approaching, like I said, hearing is one of the last things, but also your body doesn't need food anymore. So it shuts down probably a day or two before, and they're not starving themselves. Their body just actually doesn't need to be sustained through food anymore because they don't need to conserve that energy for anything else. You might hear what is called the death rattle. It's really just a noise going over secretions in the chest. It's actually a lot more disturbing for the people around the resident, for the resident themselves, which is kind of comforting to know because a lot of the times the family in the room is like, what is going on? They're choking. They're not. They're actually okay. It's more disturbing for the people out in the room than for the person. You might look for something called mottling, and that is just a discoloration around the knees. You'll start feeling the skin is a little bit cool and clammy. And sometimes you see the earlobes retract a little bit. And then you know, it's not everybody does this, but sometimes. And then in even rare cases, you might even see a tear being shed.
Wow. That all sounds very gross, but very interesting. The ears retracting thing really got me. I didn't think that was a thing, but some really cool facts there about death. You mentioned that hospices are completely their own separate thing from hospitals, which I'm sure a lot of people maybe didn't know. I'm curious to know if you have an answer to this, kind of, I guess, why that is. I would assume, I mean, the care that you get in a hospital is, I guess, it's usually for people who are not facing long-term illnesses. But as I mentioned before, like a lot of small towns and smaller cities don't have hospices. They just have hospitals, and hospitals go about an entirely different way of treating patients than hospices do. Why is there that divide? It seems silly to me that hospice wouldn't just be like a natural integrated part of the hospital system. Do you know why there is that divide?
I'm not entirely sure why the divide is there, but to me, when I think of hospitals by nature, it's where someone goes to get better or to be treated, to have surgery. At the end of the day, though, they're hopefully leaving and going home, whereas hospice is looked at sort of as the final stop, where it's not sterile, it's not people in scrubs. Like, I don't wear scrubs at hospice, I wear business casual. So it's essentially like going into someone's home. So I think to merge the two, you might lose out on the value that is hospice, because hospice, you don't prolong or hasten death, it's just where people go. It's not like they're waiting out their time there either. It's a very special place. It's just very different than a hospital setting. And I think to merge the two, you would lose out on the whole mission and vision of what a hospice is.
Okay. So you see value then in them being separated?
I absolutely do. I wish there were more of them in relation to how many hospitals we see. But definitely, yeah.
I know the very first time that I kind of heard about hospices, but was still very unclear about what they were, that every time the word hospice was even uttered, there was like a spooky rattle that accompanied it. Like it's always been this really kind of morbid, there's been like a morbid ideas surrounding it. You said that there's a specific set of criteria that people need to meet before they can come to hospice. So what is that criteria?
So it's something called the PPS, which is the Palliative Performance Scale. And there's different percentages. And if you're at 30% or lower, then you qualify to come. Now, people don't pay to stay at hospice. But we do have what I was talking about, the LHINs, the local health integration networks. They go out and they assess that person either from hospital. You have to have a referral. So either from hospital or from home. And then we assess if you're bedbound, if you're able to eat and drink, what stage your cancer is at, if it happens to be cancer that's bringing you in.
So since people aren't paying then, earlier you had talked about funding and, they're volunteer run and this and that. Is that then essentially how it gets paid for the food and the upkeep of the hospice and any new things that might need to be brought in? Is it through those like contributions and through that fundraising and things?
Yes, it's through that. I believe sometimes the government gives you a little bit of money based off of where you're located, but the rest you have to fundraise. I think it's like 80% that you need to fundraise. At one of the hospices I work at, there's a $200 deposit that you pay upon coming in, and then you get it once the resident has passed, or the family chooses to donate it back. We have partnerships with pharmacies, so the local pharmacies will provide the medications for the residents.
Okay. So there are still, you're still giving medications and things like that. But is the approach in terms of treatment and medication quite a bit, I guess, less in terms of what you would expect at a hospital?
Mm-hmm. So we don't wake people up at 8 a.m. because their scheduled meds are for 8 a.m. If we find they can't take oral pills, we go to through the skin. A lot of the times they'll come in with 20 different medications. We cut it down to 5. And when I say we, I mean the doctors. I don't make that decision. But a lot of times it's just pain control, because a lot of times they're not eating, so they don't need their diabetic medications or their stomach medications that they were on before, or even sometimes their heart medications. Okay.
This might be kind of an off-topic question a little bit, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway, because it does definitely fit in with the topic of death. It's just not about hospices per se. My question is, what is your stance? And I'm sure that you could probably provide me with a very long and lengthy answer to this. But what is your stance on... I guess I don't even really know what the proper term for it is anymore, but essentially euthanasia. Like, what is the proper term today?
So the proper term today is actually called medical assistance in dying, so MAID for short. Okay. So the very definition, or at its core, of hospice is it does not prolong or hasten death. So either there needs to be a definition change of what hospice means, or they need to keep the two separate. So right now, the two hospices I work at do not perform medical assistance in dying, but we provide information to residents who have questions. I personally believe in choice, giving more options to people sometimes even brings them comfort just knowing they have the option there. And I'll have the conversation with people, but as a rule, we're not supposed to bring it up unless they bring it up themselves. But I definitely think there's a place for it in society. I think it's important. I think we're moving towards that more and more. But right now, the two are kept separate just because at its definition, that's what hospice is.
To follow up with that, I'm wondering what your stance then is on... maybe people who can't communicate, who have lost the ability to communicate, or children who can't consent to assisted dying is, I know that there's been like a lot of parental requests and a lot of parental support behind that movement for children who, are born with illnesses, who they believe are living a very kind of low quality of life. What is your stance on that? I know it's extremely controversial and there's so many kind of legalities with that issue, but what is your stance on that? And I guess, do you ever think that we're going to kind of reach a point where it's not a gray area anymore? We kind of have some closure on that issue.
I definitely hope there's some closure on that issue. I feel like personally, this is completely like my own thoughts on the matter, but I don't think it's fair to provide it for some and not others. I think children suffer through the same life-limiting illnesses that adults do, and to even take away that option, to not even have that option there for them, I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's right. I understand that they can't fully consent, but children know when they're dying, and they know that they're dying, and they experience dying. So why is the option not there for them? And I just feel like I said earlier, even just to have that option would bring people comfort, would bring children comfort. They can understand things, maybe not when you throw a bunch of medical jargon in there, but if you talk to a child about what they want, I'm sure that they can talk to you better than their parents can. But also I think it's important to get their parents on board on the matter. Not saying it's right for everyone, because it's not. It's not suitable. It's not the suitable option for everyone. But even just to allow it in society to be an option, I think it would be an important step.
You said that your hospice is 18 and older, so you haven't yet had any experiences working with children in a hospice capacity?
I've taken a workshop, but really that's about it. There are some hospices that are 16 and above, but I haven't seen anything lower than that. I know for a long time, even like the pediatric palliative care team in Toronto was in the basement of sick kids, because it was like, oh no, like every child that comes in here walks out of here.
Oh my goodness, that's nuts. I'm curious to know if there's and I know you aren't going to have like numbers or statistics on this necessarily, but is there kind of like an overwhelming, I guess, lean towards like one illness or disease that you see come up with your residents a lot?
So a majority of the people I see are people with cancer. Not the same cancer, just varying types. And I sort of attribute it to the fact that people are living a lot longer with life-limiting illnesses coming into play near the end. But definitely, it's not to say that I only see older people with cancer. I have seen people in their 30s and 20s as well.
Wow. Cancer's a real bitch. What about for you? So what is to come for you? I'm interested to know, do you want to continue working in hospice forever? Is that kind of your long-term goal? Or what would be, I guess, some of your future goals relating to this topic?
I will always do, I think, hospice palliative care for my soul. It doesn't even need to be my primary source of income. I do it because I love doing it. So I'd like to be a part of it for forever if I could. And I'd really, actually, the dream would be to open a children's hospice, because I feel like still in society we live, especially in Western civilization, we live in such a privileged place where it's outside of the norm and parents aren't supposed to bury their children. So we don't talk about children dying, but children die. And where do they go? Where is a place for them? The hospices that I work at are 18 and above, so there's no place for children below that. So it would be amazing to create an environment for them specifically.
Yeah. I think, death is taboo, and children's death is like 20 times heavier than that. So you're right, that's totally not something. I think not only does it combine that like fear of the unknown, but it's just something that like you assume is not supposed to happen. because these are people who are just starting out on this journey of life. But you're totally right. There's no age that is like appropriate necessarily for death. I mean, it happens when it happens. I think it would be great if we had, the resources and whatnot to give children that place as well. If anything, those are probably the people who maybe need it more, because it's this whole loss of innocence, where not only are they losing the normality, but they're losing, the ability to start and to live their lives and to be children. So great goal. I think that's an awesome goal. And I hope that in the future, I definitely see more of those. To end off, I'd really like to just circle back to when we were talking about some of the stories and the conversations that you've had with residents. I'm really curious to know if the residents, I know that again, it's probably different for every individual, but I guess on average, like, do you find that when the time comes that they're like ready to die? Are they in like positive spirit? Are they scared? What are kind of some of those emotions that you've seen, like right before they die?
Mm-hmm. Like you said, it's very individualized, so it's not the same for everyone. But you definitely, with some, you see that they're at peace. They've said the goodbyes that they wanted to say. Some of them wait to hear from their family that it's okay for them to go. And it's almost like magic. It could be hours since their family left and let them know it's okay. And then they let themselves go, which is really nice to see. Or sometimes they hold on till that grandson can make their flight to Ontario. And then as soon as they step into the building, then they know it's okay for them to go.
I think that's a really crazy thing that the body and the mind are like capable of holding on like that. I've definitely seen that before of people in my life passing, around big events like Christmas and things like that, when the entire family is gathered, and then shortly after it's, Christmas is done and all the family's been home, then they pass. It's always been so interesting to me that it's sort of kind of like this final send off. Do you ever talk to your residents about regrets? Do you ever ask them if there's anything that they wish they would have done with their life, or if they have, if they have any sage life advice for you? Like, what are the closing remarks like?
Yeah, so near the end, of course, with their body shutting down, sometimes they're not able to talk to you anymore. But during the time that they do share a lot of insights with me. Some just, exactly what you'd think someone would say, just very positive, like, oh, you should enjoy being young while you're young. And you hear that all the time and you think, oh, yeah, you're just saying that. But it's true. It's really true. You need to start living before you hear that you're going to die. And that's one of the biggest things that I hear the residents say is, oh, I wish I took that trip, or I wish I didn't wait to retire, it's true. So it's just a daily reminder to do what you want to do while you can do it. And, yeah.
Yeah, I think it carries so much more weight coming from somebody whose life is essentially over. It's definitely different hearing it from, your mom or your dad, but from somebody who's lived their entire life, and at the end of it, that's still kind of what they have to say as their last remarks. I think that's pretty special. So the takeaway: live while you're young and have fun and take that trip.
It's true.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here today and for talking about death. I know it's not a topic that people love talking about, so I'm very lucky that I got someone who does love to talk about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation.
You're welcome. That's our show. Thanks for tuning in this week to Fully Exposed. I hope your ass has been sufficiently educated.
This has been an Evoke Media podcast.